Shawn, you're on.
Hi. Thank you, everyone, for showing up, both here and remotely. Quickly, a little bit about myself. So I'm a assistant professor and founding faculty at the 10th campus out in the Central Valley. It's always great to come back to Berkeley here to visit. My interests kind of stem from image processing, computer vision, and then taking things a bit higher than that, going into pattern recognition, machine learning, and data mining. But usually always kind of starting from some sort of complex data, images or video or some long lines, and then trying to work up the extracting knowledge up from that. So I'll be talking to you today about one aspect of this work in the context of remote sensed imagery, and specifically looking at how we can use texture analysis, image texture analysis, to try extract information or some higher knowledge from the hordes of remote sensed imagery, satellite and aerial photographs that are being acquired. So that's what I'll be focusing on today. So kind of a quick overview. First, provide some context and some motivation about why we might want to consider texture analysis of satellite images and aerial photographs. And then get into the heart of the talk and look at, kind of talk a little bit about what texture means in terms of images and how we might come up with a way of quantifying what texture is, so that it enables some kind of computer science applications or computer science-based applications. We'll look at an example of content-based image retrieval using texture analysis. And then, given time, look at a couple of other applications that I've worked on, research applications, namely trying to model geospatial objects using texture, trying to localize spatial objects using texture, and then kind of a data mining application, trying to look at a common or trying to extract spatial arrangements of pixel values and higher level structures in satellite images. And then maybe a little bit of plug for UC Merced at the end. So first, kind of some context here. If we look at the history of kind of some of the more common commercial satellites in the last 30 years or so, with the popular Landsat satellites, and then the more recent commercial satellites, one thing we'll see is this spatial resolution. So by spatial resolution, I mean, and what is the amount, the ground coverage imaged by a single pixel in whatever sensor that you have on board one of these satellites. So back in the 70s, this was around 80 meters represented by a single pixel. But you can see with advances in technology, we're now getting down to a sub-meter spatial resolution. So, and we'll see examples of imagery both in this range and in this range, and one of my arguments is that that as we start getting into where a single pixel is more likely to be imaging a single material, that it's more important, this idea of the spatial arrangements of those pixels, of the materials on the surface of the Earth, it will be more important for understanding what is being imaged. And this will provide motivation for why I think texture is going to, it has always kind of been in the image analysis of satellite remote sensed imagery, but I think there'll be a more compelling need for it. And so this, when you go to Google Earth and you see the high resolution imagery, it's probably around one of these satellites here, the Iconos or the QuickBird. So it's around the 1 meter or sub 1 meter pixel. And then next year, the satellite GeoEye is set to be launched, which will be less than half a meter per pixel. And again, these are commercial satellites. Who knows where the military and other satellites are, but I have no knowledge of that. So I can only guess. I didn't get that far at Livermore, so I left before I got my clearance. So let's just look at 2 examples of images here. So here's an image that I just grabbed from the web from the Landsat 5 satellite around 1984. So here one pixel represents about 30 square meters on the ground. This is an image of Swansea Bay, Wales. And on the right here, everyone should be more familiar with looking at these high-resolution images now that we have things like Google Earth online. But here's an image from the QuickBird satellite in 2004 at a resolution of 0.6 meters per pixel. This is a section of the Olympic Stadium in Athens. So a couple of things. What does this enable? This increase in spatial resolution? Well, clearly one thing is you can start doing better object recognition, and that's obvious. So there's a long tradition in computer vision of recognizing objects based upon shape and other features. So that's certainly one thing that's enabled by this increase in spatial resolution. But I'm going to look at an orthogonal capability that's enabled, and that's the idea of spatial patterns of pixels becoming more informative. So and this will become more clear as the talk goes on. But we might unfortunately it's not being projected very well. But there's a mowing pattern here on the grass that is some spatial arrangement of pixel values that we might be interested in quantifying. These whatever these things that are on top of the stadium, these tiles. This themselves is not so much an object, but still might be some sort of some pattern of interest that we'd want to quantify for some reason. The trees that are making a pattern over here, and the cars or the people, I think that we can see here in this place, or whatever this pattern is down here. So orthogonal to this enabling better object recognition, I'm going to argue that, or look into what we can gain from trying to characterize the spatial relationships of the pixel values in these new generations of imagery. So this idea of increased spatial resolution, as I was alluding to before, that individual pixels are more likely to represent the spectral reflectance of regions composed of a single material. So if we go back and look at this 30-meter resolution image, a single pixel here is more likely to cover a variety of materials on the surface of the Earth than a pixel in our higher resolution imagery. So in the historic lower resolution imagery, people working in remote sensing would try to use a technique called spectral unmixing to try to determine what materials might exist in the region that's imaged by a single pixel. So now I'm showing where a single pixel has 3 bands, say red, green, and blue. So assuming that the materials mix, the spectral reflectance of the materials mix linearly, there's been a lot of approaches developed to try figure out to perform the reverse of that, spectrally unmix, and try identify what mix of materials. But I'm going to argue that's kind of giving way to the case on the right here, where our much increased spatial resolution is more likely that these individual pixels are covering single materials. So we no longer, it's not so important to apply spectral unmixing at the individual pixels, but more important to try to determine what the arrangement of the pixels or the materials that they're imaging. And it might be that this arrangement of materials might be the distinguishing characteristic of particular land cover class that we're interested in. Okay, so let's talk a little bit, step back a little bit and think about texture. So texture in images, I feel is something, is one of those things that it's hard to quantify. It's one of those things perceptually, you kind of know it when you see it. Of course, that doesn't really help people working in computer vision. You want to try to come up with a quantitative characterization. So here I have some examples from a standard texture database called the Brodats texture database, and the images along the top here. And I think everyone would agree that these are these are textured images, whether they're of fabric or of bricks. They're the kind of regular patterns. But here's another set of images, which people would also probably agree these have texture, but they're not nearly as regular or as deterministic, and yet they're using the word textures is equally appropriate just to describe them. That these are textured images, as the images on the top row. So I'm going to so texture. Besides things like color, is like things like colors, a fundamental characteristic of images. We're going to think about it here roughly as the spatial distribution of pixel values. And some of the terms that you might, in English, you might use to describe texture, things like texture is coarse or fine, and so on. And then there's also the issue or the potential for having directionality. So you have these terms for describing texture. But what if we want to come up with a quantitative description of the spatial distribution of pixel values in images, for example, to perform analysis of remote sensed imagery? So how might we go about doing this? So there's been a long history of studying texture in images. Now, I'll just not going to go into the technical details, but just mention a few of the more popular approaches. So first, you might just think about textures being kind of how do the pixel values vary in a given region, and not really thinking about what the precise spatial arrangements are, but just think something along the lines of what's the mean value and what's the standard deviation of the pixel values. So that might give you one measure of texture, but that wouldn't get you too far. So then some other approaches include things, something called a co-occurrence matrix, where you estimate the spatial co-occurrence of pixel values. So basically, you build up a counting table of how many times a pixel of intensity 10 occurs at some particular spatial orientation with a pixel of value 20. You do this for all possible pixel values. So if your images are grayscale and have values from 0 to 255, you're going to have this 256 by 256 matrix of counts of every time a pixel, say, might occur to the left of a pixel with value I might occur to the left of a pixel of value j. And then with that 256 square matrix, you compute a couple of measurements or ways of what's characterized by those counts, and reduce it down. And I'm not going to go to the technical details, but essentially reduce this down to just a couple of values. Variograms come from geospatial analysis and measure some way or measure of how values in a geographic region vary with of some geographic measurement. Traditionally, things like temperature or other non-image characteristics vary linearly with distance over a region. But they've also been adapted for trying to understand how pixel values vary. Of course, when you think about texture, it's natural to think about it being some sort of repetitious or having some sort of periodicity. So that would naturally make you want to think about doing some sort of Fourier analysis. So this is one natural approach, and people have looked at this. So wavelets are similar. Rather than decomposing your two-dimensional signal into Fourier components, you might have another set of basis functions, and there's a variety of different wavelets. And it's kind of a more kind of exotic approach is to think about, people have approached looking at the surface of your textured image, so thinking about it as kind of a three-dimensional surface, and then measuring the fractal dimension of that surface and using that as some kind of gauge for what texture is represented there. And finally, considering the two-dimensional arrangement of pixels as being a Markov random field, where each pixel is an instantiation of a random variable, is another common approach. So what I'm going to be looking at today, the approach is kind of a hybrid between Fourier analysis and wavelets based on something called Gabor functions. And so we'll look a little more closely at the technical details of this approach. But anyway, so there's been, long and the short of it, there has been a lot of work in image texture analysis. But what I'll show you is perhaps some of the more successful approaches, depending on what application you're looking at. So, okay, here's a picture, an Iconos 1 meter resolution picture of Los Angeles. So everyone by now is, when I would give these talks a few years ago, these images were probably a lot more interesting now with things like Google Earth. Everyone's kind of used to looking at this kind of imagery. So here we see freeways. There's a lot of housing developments, some sort of industrial park, a golf course. But one of the things that stands out here is that there's this idea of these spatial patterns that the pixels make. Can be indicative of what kinds of land, what we call land cover classes, exist in this region. So maybe, as I was saying, orthogonal to doing some sort of object recognition is to try approach analyzing or understanding images such as these from a texture-based approach. So let me switch over to a demonstration really quickly, which will hopefully continue to motivate the problem here, but it's also a demo which I always find kind of fun to play with. So this is a little demo that's running on my laptop here, and I have 7 of these Iconos images from around the United States. So I'm going to pick an image from just around the corner here, Santa Clara. And so this is a little kind of custom Java-based demo where we've taken these 7 large images and broken them, segmented them, or chunked them into, I think this is 128 by 128 pixel squares. So out of these 7 images, there's approximately 300,000 of these little regions. And for each one of these little regions, we've extracted, done a kind of a quantitative description, and I'll get to the details on that, quantitatively described the texture or the spatial arrangement of the pixel values in that region. So having done this, a pre-processing step where I've done this for the 300,000 little tiles in this set of 7 large images, what I'm going to show here is how can we use this texture, this quantification of the texture to manage or to interact with this data set. And specifically, I'm going to show how we might do what's called content-based retrieval. We might use this as our query image to return those tiles in this set of 300,000 tiles that are most similar to this tile with respect to our texture descriptor. So I'll go ahead and do that now. So this is a pretty easy query. So I'm going to, again, here's my query tile. It's displayed again in the top left here. And I'm going to ask do a query where I'm going to say, return to me the 128 tiles that are most similar to this query tile based upon texture. So if I issue that that query. So again, here's our query tile. The most similar one is the same tile, which obviously should be the case. And then in rank order, so decreasing similarity, are tiles out of this 300,000 set of 300,000 tiles that are most similar to our query image, and kind of a little indication of what image they're coming, which of these large images they're coming from. You can see most of them are also from the Santa Clara image, but we have one from New York here. And then this valley, which might be a bit hard to see, which starts off at 0 and increases, is a measure of similarity of how similar each of these tiles is to our query image. So this value here is what allows us to do this rank ordering. Okay, so things look good there. Another way, rather than asking for return me the most similar tiles, another way is to say, show me those tiles on this image that are similar in some sense to my query tile. So this involves setting a threshold, say, and this is an arbitrary value, but asking the system to show me all tiles in this image that are within this arbitrary distance 1 in some feature space to my query tile. So you see that was fairly successful, where it's identified similar water tiles. This is part of the bay up here, as well as other tiles that are possibly not water, but also but have no texture and therefore are considered visually similar. And this is where you can see where this idea of visual similarity doesn't necessarily mean semantic similarity. It's one of the things that plagues this area of computer vision, content-based retrieval, and other aspects-based, other techniques based upon low-level descriptions of image regions.
Because you don't consider the intensity of the color?
Well, no, just that. I mean, things can be. The idea is that things can. So he's saying he asked because we don't consider the color here. No, it's more that because we're only looking at what's visually in this square. So two things that are visually similar might be semantically quite different. So most people interacting, with this might want to operate with it at the semantic level, return me regions that are semantically like this. But what we're extracting here at this low-level texture level can only perform this similarity retrieval, which often turns out to match well with the higher-level semantic, but doesn't always. So that was kind of an easy, there was kind of a lack of texture in that image. But what if we pick this square here? I think this is a mobile home park, and use that as our query and let's see what happens there. So again, the same texture features, and so here's our query tile. The same tile is the first in our ranked list, and then out of these 300,000, where we've pre-processed the texture descriptors, we can now do the same similarity retrieval, and so you can kind of see that we're getting extracted one feature, texture. And it's somewhat a general purpose way of at least visually describing what's in these images. Let me do a couple more of these, and then we'll go on to looking at exactly how are we accomplishing this. So if I go over to Los Angeles, and down here I know that there's a parking lot somewhere.
In Los Angeles?
Yeah, exactly. So here's another instance of a land cover class, full parking lots which have perhaps consider having a distinctive texture signature. So let's do the same. Nearest, what are the 128 tiles, or there's 300 that are most similar, and you can see now we have pictures of parking lots. So this kind of when this got this operational, let me do one of a freeway region here. So here's a freeway in Los Angeles. And we're getting freeways back. So hopefully...
That's only horizontal for the...
Yeah, okay, so very good. So I just want to see if someone's going to notice that. So he's pointing out that we're only returning freeways that are oriented the same way as our query image. And that's true. But there is... this, and before I can't say much about it before going into the details of how we're extracting this feature. If I select this button here, rotation invariant, I can do the same search and have it be rotationally invariant. So it's kind of a nice thing about these descriptors that they support both rotationally invariant and rotationally sensitive similarity in this case, without having to recompute the feature vectors or the texture descriptors. Okay, so so you look at that and you go, well, this looks like texture is this seems to be working, at least in terms of returning things that are visually similar as far as what the human visual system thinks is similar. So let's look a little more closely at what is the technology that's underlying the demo that I just showed. So how are we quantifying the texture in these little squares that allows us to do this similarity retrieval? So we're going to consider texture. So I'm going to talk about texture analysis based on something called Gabor filters for the next part of my talk. So we're going to consider texture, again, a spatial pattern that has two qualities: a granularity, kind of a measure of coarseness, and also a direction. And what we're going to, and here's one of our sample little regions that we want to quantify the texture. And what we're going to do is apply a bank of filters called a Gabor filter bank, where there's filters that are tuned to different scales and different orientations. So different scales to capture this measure of granularity, and different orientations to capture this sense of this concept of direction. So for each one of the filters in this Gabor filter bank that's tuned to a specific scale and orientation, we're going to end up with one output, a filtered image, and then we're going to summarize those filtered images to form a compact descriptor of the texture in our image, of this kind of the scales and orientations that are occurring in there. So a little technical part of my talk. What are these Gabor filters? They're basically just based on the convolution with a filter with a kernel called a Gabor based on a Gabor function. So if you think about this is our x, y pixel coordinates, and this is the pixel values, the height here. We're going to form these convolution kernels by taking a Gaussian, which will localize our analysis in the space in x and y, and then modulate it, with a sinusoidal signal, two-dimensional sinusoidal signal, to give us this idea of granularity, frequency, and orientation, direction. And by designing different Gabor filters based upon different Gabor functions, different convolutional kernels, we can derive a set of filter banks that have different granularity and tuned to different granularities and different orientations. So if we look down on top of one of these Gabor functions, it'll look like this. So again, the pixel values here are indicated by height, and the pixel values here are by black and white. So the trick is designing this set of convolutional kernels, which we're going to convolve with our images, and end up with a set of filtered images that gives us an idea of granularity and orientation. So just to look at this alternately in the frequency domain, so this is what our filters look like, our convolutional kernels look like in the spatial domain. If you think about this in the two-dimensional frequency domain, we're working with images, so our frequency domain has two dimensions. The kind of the footprints of these, the support areas of support of these filters form these regions where going outward from DC, they're capturing different granularity or different frequency, and then kind of the rotation, depending on where it is around the radius here, dictates its orientation. So just another way of viewing, either convolving here in the spatial domain or multiplying here in the frequency domain. So a couple of nice traits about these Gabor functions, and won't go into detail here, but they can be shown to maximize, optimize spatial and frequency localization. So this basically says that they optimize your ability to tell what what frequencies or what kinds of patterns or repetitive patterns are occurring where. And then kind of an interesting thing is that there's perhaps some psychovisual evidence that some sort of filtering, Gabor-like filtering, actually occurs early in mammalian vision, and specifically that it's been shown that in the primary visual cortex there's actually individual cells which are tuned to these Gabor-like patterns. So presented with a particular Gabor-like pattern of particular coarseness and direction, one of these cells will be selective to that. So there's potentially you might make the argument that the reason that this approach to analyzing texture agrees with how we perceive textures being similar might have its basis in something like that. But and then one last little step. A few years ago, the MPEG-7 multimedia content description interface standard was created, which, unlike the previous MPEGs, which dealt with video coding, this deals with standardizing content descriptors such as texture, color, shape, and so on for multimedia, for images and video. And this approach to doing texture analysis based on Gabor filters through a competitive phase was accepted into the standard. So there's something called the homogeneous texture descriptor, which is very similar to what I'm describing today, which has been standardized by MPEG-7. So let's go back a little bit to how, this set of Gabor filters. Now, how I'm actually getting how are we actually quantifying in some compact way what the texture is in these little regions? So again, applying this Gabor filter bank, we end up with a set of filtered images where each image is the output of a specific Gabor filter tuned to a particular scale and orientation. So we typically have something around 6 scales and 6 orientations. So we might end up with a 36-dimensional, 36 of these filtered images. So this is kind of bad news. We've started with one image. Now we have 36 images, kind of a significant data expansion. But what we simply do to reduce that, for each of these filtered images, we compute 2 values, the mean and the standard deviation. So again, this is a filtered image, a 2-dimensional filtered image, corresponding to one of the Gabor filters. And we just reduce that to two values, the mean and the standard deviation. Put all these together in a feature vector, and this is our description of the texture. So if we have 36 filters, we'll have 72 values that describe the texture. So that is our description of the. And that turns out, if we use these say 72 dimensional feature vectors. So given the feature vector of one image, a feature vector for another image, by simply taking some norm distance of them, we can come up with a measure of visual similarity. And this is exactly what's going on in the demo. Let's go back to the demo really quickly. So again, each of these, for each of these little regions in this image, we've done this Gabor filtering and then collapsed that down to 72 values. So describe a feature vector, 72-dimensional feature vector describing each of these tiles. And then we do our similarity search by just doing a Euclidean distance between the feature vector for our query tile and the feature vectors for all the tiles in our data set. End up with a value and then rank order the results based upon that. Yeah. So how do we choose the number of scales and directions? So that's kind of application specific. So there's a trade-off there. You have the more scales you have on your filter bank, the more directions, the more sensitive you'll be. But now you're going to end up with a longer feature vector, and you start running into more problems of working in a higher dimensional space. So it's application specific, and we haven't done any exhaustive studies on what's better for what, but it's kind of a manually chosen thing at the moment.
Performance increased with increasing the number of scales and
Actually, we haven't even, like, in terms of like a similarity retrieval, haven't really even like done that kind of analysis. Yeah, and even measure. One of the challenges is here is, we can visually see that this seems to be working, but how do you quantify that these are the actual tiles that so that should be returned? So you have to establish some sort of a ground truth on these images. Given this query, these are the top X tiles, and that's difficult. There's a lot of subjectivity there.
Or do you assume that the sample image has the same resolution as the image you are going to compare?
Yeah, so the question was, do we assume that the query and the target images are at the same spatial resolution? Yes, we do. So definitely that could affect, since we're using fixed filter banks. But like there was a trick that we play with being able to be orientation invariant, there's some tricks we can play to being scale invariant.
So what happens if you compare the two sets of images that has a different spatial resolution?
Yeah, then if you doing so, comparing textures will, according to these set filter banks, textures that may appear visually similar but at different scales will be different according to this approach, without building something in to acknowledge that. Yeah. Yeah.
So can you choose a set of scales and orientation to make the set of Gabor filters to be orthogonal? Like the wavelets.
They end up not being orthogonal. There's some redundancy there. So, but we try to reduce it. So they're not true wavelets, or they're not. I mean, they're very similar to wavelets. They are wavelets actually, but they're not orthogonal wavelets. There's some overlap in the frequency domain because of the Gaussian envelopes. Okay, so things are going a bit slower than I thought here. So that was, this is kind of is tempting here, where we seem to be able to come up with some sort of quantitative descriptor that seems to do pretty well at characterizing these patterns in these remote sensed images. But content-based retrieval is a pretty limited application. So how can we, build upon this and try to come up with ways of classifying regions into and performing other, perhaps more relevant functions than content-based retrieval. So I'll go quickly through this part of the talk. So part of the next stage here was to start with this texture characterization and try to think about different types of geospatial objects for which things like shape might not be very important, but things like they might have distinctive texture signatures, and how can we start building models of these objects? So examples of these types of things are listed here. So things like agricultural sites, fields, end up having fairly distinctive textures and so on. And so how, coming up with a method for learning learning what these the kind of modeling these types of objects, things that I'm calling geospatial objects. So here, so with this approach, where we come up with something called texture motifs. So what are given these geospatial objects for which texture seems that seem to have distinct signature textures? How can we characterize the common textures between these objects? So for harbors, the common textures might be the moored boats and the water. So how can we build a statistical model to learn what these texture signatures are? And so things like golf courses. So again, things like the shape of the golf course is not significant, and even the particular pixel values, because you have grass and trees, but certainly you have grass and trees and other types of regions. But it's perhaps the spatial patterns made by the grass and trees that make these distinctive as golf courses, and then mobile home parks. So the premise here was that these texture motifs, these common textures, are somehow clustered in this high-dimensional feature space. So if we can just learn what these clusters are, that'll stand as a model for these various geospatial objects. So I'll kind of won't go. I think I'll just kind of leave it at that. So this next part, this part of my work tries to learn statistically what these clusters are, what these motifs are, and then use that to go label, given a set of images, unknown regions, to try identify, where is this a harbor based upon? Does it have these particular motifs that show up? And then, let's see. So one other extension of this is something called a gazetteer, which is a directory of kind of objects, geographic objects, and their locations on the Earth. So there's large collections of these, but they typically don't have a bounding box representation of these objects, just include a single longitude, latitude point. So for example, for this mobile home park in this gazetteer, it might only have the spatial location of the single point. And what you really want to represent is the bounding box, even if it's a crude bounding box. So I looked at ways of using, again, looking at the texture, the motifs that constitute these objects, to try initiate a bounding box at one of these interior points and grow it to have a bounding box representation. So I'll just show a little demo here. So here we started with the initial point, the seed point, and then we're growing this this bounding box based upon the the learned texture motifs for golf courses, and you can see how this bounding box, and this is not live, this is pre-computed, but so some sort of a coarse segmentation based upon the statistics of the textures that are in this region, and similarly for mobile home parks. And I think I'll, in the interest of, so just a quick wrap-up slide. So there's a lot of temptation here where texture seems to potentially play an important role in analyzing, especially the high-resolution remote sensed imagery, but somehow feel like we're not quite there yet. We can do this similarity retrieval, some other progress in characterizing certain objects which have distinctive texture characteristics. But I think there's still work that I'm interested in pursuing here. One interesting extension here is to look at the new types of modes of imaging hyperspectral texture. So where typical imagery these days might have 3 or 4 bands, red, green, and blue, and possibly near infrared, something from a device called Imagery has 224 of these bands. So you might have a 1,000 by 1,000 pixel image, and for each pixel you have 224 measurements instead of just 3 or 4. So what does texture mean in this kind of data cube? So that's something that I'm looking at.
So how is it different from the single pattern with the bounding box? So I guess you need a different structure to represent the collection of the patterns, much like the golf course. So you can just compare the patterns at a specific area in the golf course that is composed of the trees or the grass, but I guess the texture for the golf course or some specific area will be quite different. So how can you represent it? Is it array of values, or how do you represent the bounding box of a specific area?
So what's the question? Can you summarize the question?
So how would you represent the bounding box for the? Well, I mean, so if I'm understanding it right, you would just have kind of 1 point, longitude, latitude, and then.
No. So I guess it's kind of the collection of patterns.
Oh, so how would you summarize? Okay, so if you wanted to actually, so not just specify what the physical bounding box is, but how do you represent what that area is in terms of the textures? Yeah, then, I mean, one way would be to have some sort of statistical, what's the statistical distribution of the textures that occur in there. So different ways. So, yeah, what is the model for that? And if I'd had more time, I could have talked a little more about that, representing it using a mixture of Gaussians. Okay, so sorry that ran out of time here, but we can take questions on what I have presented.
Well, first, let's thank you very much for a very interesting talk. And the way we do this is with this.
Thank you. Thank you. Very interesting. On your applet demo, was that computing the vectors in real time, what you showed us where you were coming up with the 100? Okay.
No, so yeah, there's a pre-processing step there, which it takes a while.
A while meaning minutes, hours?
Yeah, minutes, hours.
Okay. And it noticed many of the matches were from, it was looking at all 7 of those images.
Yeah, so the search was in real time.
Okay.
But the benefit there, so even though you have to do this pre-processing step, what I was showing is that extracting this one descriptor enabled many types of searches. So it wasn't like we had to compute a descriptor for parking lots, but this kind of was somewhat generic.
I have a question. You've applied this to satellite imagery, but have you thought about applying it to images that can be obtained with very, very high-resolution cameras that are terrestrial? So, for instance, surveillance cameras might be very interesting because the resolution there is really getting to be quite incredible.
Yeah, actually, that's something that's just I haven't done it, and it's something that's coming to mind. And now with the advanced, the technology. I mean, traditionally in one of the reasons that I focused on remote sensed imagery here because there were images that had this rich collection of textures,
right.
Snapshot images, typically shape. But now with higher resolution cameras, I think texture could start becoming more important in surveillance or even just snapshot, object recognition, but with not having a 1 megapixel camera, but having a gigapixel camera.
Exactly.
And I think the other area there. So I think that's something that I'm going to start looking towards. If I can get some of those images or seeing what the other thing is in biological imaging. As another area that I didn't talk about today, but there's a lot more work being done at the cellular and subcellular level. And this is some work that I'd started as a graduate student. I'm starting up again now and just didn't have time. But different imaging modalities.
Other questions? Here's a question.
At the beginning, you mentioned something about the response was related to the, I don't remember exactly how you put it, but the uniformity of the spectral distribution over the area that you were picking up.
So, okay. So you mean when we had these larger pixels before, or?
I thought what you were saying was, maybe I misunderstood this, but towards the beginning that if you had somewhat of a uniform area, that you would have a higher response than if you had some variability, I presume, across the spectrum within that area. Am I not getting that right?
Well, was this in the demo showing the?
No, it was very nearly at the beginning, and so maybe I'm not remembering it well enough. One of the first few slides, and I just was wondering what the granularity of that distribution was that you meant, because.
Okay, let's go right. I'm not quite understanding. Okay, so.
Wait, go back one. It might have been the previous thing.
Like here?
Yeah, there we go. The first bullet, actually.
Okay, so this is just kind of a speculation that as you have increased spatial resolution, what any one of these pixels is looking at is more likely to be a single reflectance from a single material on the Earth. And I mean, this is in context of what's traditionally been a problem when you had these coarse pixels, is that a single pixel that's 30 meters by 30 meters is going to include grass, cement, a whole bunch of things. And so there's been a lot of techniques to actually tease out, especially demix, what the reflectance is there. So that traditional problem of what is the mixture of elements there, in my mind, is giving way to what is the spatial arrangement of those materials. This is just kind of speculation.
Maybe we should take other questions offline and thank Shawn for a very interesting talk. Thank you, Shawn, for coming. Appreciate it.